Think of the last time you felt truly seen by someone. Not just noticed, but understood and accepted. That sense of belonging and being welcomed by another, along with the warmth and satisfaction of a connection to someone else, are the feelings of intimacy. Those feelings of intimacy are one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction we have. Tonight, we're going to explore what intimacy really is, why it matters so much, and how to build and maintain it in your life. Whether you're thinking about romantic relationships, friendships, or family bonds, understanding intimacy can transform how you connect with the people who matter most to you. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin this journey into one of the most important aspects of being human, the ability to truly know and be known by another person. So let's start with the most fundamental question. What is intimacy? Intimacy is the felt experience of being known and accepted. It's different from just being known. Your dentist knows your dental history, but that's not intimate. Your boss knows your work schedule, but that's not intimate either. The key elements that make something intimate are these: revealing something genuine about yourself, having it received without judgment, and experiencing mutual understanding. Let me give you an example. Imagine you share with a friend that you've been struggling with, feeling inadequate at work. You tell them about the doubts you have, the worry that you're not measuring up. Instead of immediately trying to fix it or minimize it, your friend says, "That sounds really hard. I've felt that way too." That moment of recognition, that feeling of being understood and not judged, that's intimacy. Your friend didn't solve your problem, but they met you where you were. And in that moment, you felt less alone. Intimacy comes in many forms, and understanding these different types can help you recognize and nurture them in your own relationships. Physical intimacy is physical contact with another person. It includes sexual and non-sexual touch, physical closeness, even synchronized movement. It's dancing with someone, holding hands during a difficult conversation, a friend resting their head on your shoulder during a movie, or the simple comfort of sitting in companionable silence next to someone you care about. Physical intimacy is about feeling safe and comfortable in someone's physical presence. For some people, physical intimacy is easier or seen as less of a risk than the next type of intimacy, emotional intimacy. Emotional intimacy is about sharing feelings and being open about your internal experiences. It's about mutual emotional attunement, being in tune with each other's emotional states. For example, instead of telling your partner, "I don't know what to do," about a decision, you might say, "I feel scared about this decision." That's emotional intimacy, revealing the feeling underneath the situation. Or think about a parent who validates a child's disappointment about a canceled play date instead of immediately trying to cheer them up. That acknowledgement of emotion creates emotional intimacy. Intellectual intimacy happens when you share ideas, engage in meaningful dialogue, and allow yourself to be intellectually challenged in a safe way. This might look like having a friend you can debate politics with, where you disagree but both feel respected. Or it might be sharing a half-formed idea with someone and having them help you think it through rather than judge it. Intellectual intimacy means you feel safe expressing your thoughts with another person. Spiritual intimacy involves shared meaning-making, exploring existential questions together, and discovering aligned values. This doesn't necessarily mean religious beliefs, though it can. Spiritual intimacy might be two people from different faith traditions discussing what gives their lives purpose. Or it might be partners discussing what kind of legacy they want to leave their children. It's about connecting on the level of what matters most, what gives life meaning. Experiential intimacy is created through shared experiences, creating memories together, going on adventures, doing collaborative activities. Think about the bond formed between bandmates after performing together for years. They've shared the nervousness before shows, the thrill of connecting with an audience, the mistakes and the triumphs. Or think about friends who backpacked through Europe together and still reference those shared experiences decades later. You had to be there to understand, and that shared experience creates a unique bond. Now, here's what's fascinating. These different types of intimacy interconnect and strengthen each other. When people share multiple types of intimacy, their overall feelings of intimacy deepen. In contrast, for example, physical intimacy without emotional intimacy often feels hollow or lacking. This is why many people report feeling unsatisfied with hookup culture. The physical connection is there, but it lacks the emotional foundation that makes it meaningful. Intellectual intimacy can create safety for emotional vulnerability. When you understand how someone thinks, it becomes easier to understand how they feel. Experiential intimacy accelerates other forms of connection. The Gottmans, two American psychologists who have studied relationships for decades, found that shared challenges fast-track bonding. When you go through something difficult together, it strengthens your connection. But of all these types, emotional intimacy is the glue that holds the others together. You can have great sex or fascinating conversations, but without emotional intimacy, relationships plateau or eventually dissolve. This is what researcher Brené Brown means when she talks about vulnerability being the birthplace of connection. Without that emotional openness, the other forms of intimacy can't be sustained long-term. Now, you might be wondering whether connection and intimacy mean the same thing. They're related, but there's an important difference. Connection is momentary. Intimacy is accumulated over time. Connection is what you feel when someone gets something about you in a moment. You might feel connection with a stranger who makes eye contact and smiles at you during a stressful moment in a crowded subway. There's a recognition, a moment of shared humanity. But intimacy is what you have with your sibling who knows your entire history and can finish your sentences. Intimacy is the sustained pattern of being known over time. All intimacy requires connection, but not all connection becomes intimacy. You can have one-time meaningful conversations that create connection without developing ongoing intimacy. Intimacy requires repeated connection over time, plus the willingness to be increasingly vulnerable with each other. There are also different contexts for connection and intimacy. You can feel connected to a group, a sense of community, without having intimacy with individuals in that group. Think about feeling connected to other fans at a concert. There's shared excitement, shared experience, but not intimacy. And then there are parasocial relationships, the relationships we feel we have with celebrities or influencers. These create a sense of connection, even false intimacy. But there's no reciprocity. They don't know you. The relationship exists in only one direction. True intimacy requires mutual knowing and being known. Understanding the difference between connection and intimacy naturally leads us to ask, why does intimacy matter so much? The research on this is overwhelming. Intimate relationships are essential to our well-being. The Harvard Adult Development Study, which followed people for over 80 years, found that intimate relationships are the strongest predictor of happiness and longevity. Not money, not career success, not fame. Relationships. Specifically, intimate relationships where people feel truly known and valued. Loneliness, on the other hand, is as harmful to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That finding comes from a large meta-analysis by researcher Julianne Holt-Lunstad. Our bodies and minds need intimate connection to function well. Other studies show that secure attachment in intimate relationships correlates with resilience, better emotional regulation, and lower rates of anxiety and depression. When children experience emotional intimacy with caregivers, they develop healthier self-concepts and more secure attachment styles. Adults who maintain intimate relationships show better cognitive function as they age. Our brains literally work better when we have people we're close to. The capacity for sustained intimate bonds reflects several important aspects of mental health. It shows that you can regulate your emotions, that you have a secure attachment style, that you have an integrated sense of self and can be authentic with others, and that you can tolerate vulnerability. In contrast, many personality disorders feature profound difficulties with intimacy. Narcissistic personality disorder makes intimacy difficult because intimacy requires admitting imperfection, and the narcissistic defense can't tolerate this. Avoidant personality disorder involves such intense fear of criticism and rejection that vulnerability becomes intolerable. Borderline personality disorder often involves an intense fear of abandonment that creates rapid swings between desperate intimacy and complete withdrawal. These patterns either avoid intimacy entirely or idealize and then devalue it, making sustained intimate bonds extremely difficult to maintain. Understanding intimacy, then, isn't just about having better relationships. It's about your overall health, your longevity, your mental health, and your quality of life. This is why learning to build and maintain intimate connections is one of the most important things you can do for yourself. Now that we understand why intimacy matters, we need to explore the essential role of vulnerability in creating it. Here's a truth that's both simple and challenging. No intimacy occurs without vulnerability. Let me paint a picture for you. Two co-workers can be friendly for years. They share weekend plans, complain about the boss, chat by the coffee maker, but they're not intimate. Then one day, one of them admits, "I'm struggling in my marriage," or "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this job." In that moment, intimacy becomes possible. The vulnerability opened the door. Now, feeling comfortable with vulnerability depends on what you might lose and what the risk of losing it is. This is what I call the vulnerability equation. Risk equals what you might lose, times the probability of losing it, divided by your resilience if you do lose it. Let me give you an example. Telling your therapist about your darkest thoughts feels less risky than telling your parent. Not because the therapist knows you better, but because you're not risking the relationship in the same way. The therapist won't disown you. They're trained not to judge. With your parent, you're risking something more precious, and the potential loss feels greater. Here's another example. Someone with secure self-esteem can share half-formed ideas at work because even if the ideas are criticized, their self-image remains intact. The criticism doesn't threaten who they believe they are at their core, but someone with fragile self-esteem avoids this vulnerability because criticism feels existentially threatening. It confirms their deepest fears about themselves. Brené Brown makes an important distinction between vulnerability and oversharing. Vulnerability is sharing with people who've earned the right to hear it. It's measured and appropriate to the relationship. Oversharing, on the other hand, is using strangers as therapists. It's often a bid for connection, but it can backfire because there's no foundation of trust to hold the weight of what's being shared. Vulnerability that is not oversharing considers factors such as timing, context, and who has earned your trust. It doesn't take courage to risk being criticized if your self-image will remain intact, whether you're criticized or not, or if you think the critics are worthless. Real vulnerability happens when you genuinely risk something that matters to you, with people whose opinions you care about. Vulnerability makes intimacy possible, but we also need to understand the dynamic nature of intimacy, how it changes and flows over time. Intimacy isn't static. It fluctuates naturally over time, and understanding this can help you avoid panic when intimacy temporarily decreases. Relationships have seasons. There are periods of deep connection along with periods of parallel living, where you're both functioning in your individual lanes without much intersection. Life stressors can temporarily reduce your capacity for intimacy. A couple with a newborn might have very little emotional intimacy for months. They're in survival mode, trying to sleep, trying to keep the baby healthy, trying to function. This doesn't mean the relationship is broken. It means intimacy is tabled, while other pressing needs dominate. Intimacy requires reciprocal vulnerability. It's a dance. One person shares, the other receives, and then shares. When one person consistently reveals, while the other deflects or stays guarded, intimacy stalls. It can't grow because it's not being fed from both sides. Imagine you share with a friend that you're anxious about an upcoming presentation. They respond, "You'll be fine," and change the subject. Compare that to them saying, "Tell me more about what's making you anxious." The first response blocks intimacy. It's dismissive, even if well-intentioned. The second response invites intimacy. It signals that your inner world matters and there's space for it. Intimacy can deepen or become more shallow over time. It deepens as people reveal more complex aspects of themselves, as they continue to show up for each other, as they remain curious about each other's evolving selves. It becomes shallow when people hide more, when they become less curious, when they stop what the Gottmans call turning toward. The Gottmans' research shows that couples who maintain intimacy over decades are those who continue making bids for connection and responding to those bids. A bid might be something small. "Look at that sunset," or "I had a tough day." You can turn towards the bid. "Wow, that is beautiful," or "Tell me about it." Turn away from it, ignoring them, staying focused on your phone, or turn against it. You're always complaining about your day. Turning toward, consistently and over time, maintains and deepens intimacy. Turning away or against erodes it. In partial summary, we've learned intimacy is essential, that it requires vulnerability, and that it naturally fluctuates. But what gets in the way of intimacy? Even though intimacy is essential to our well-being, many things can block it. Understanding these barriers can help you recognize them in yourself and begin to work through them. Shame is one of the most powerful barriers. Shame says, "I am bad," which makes vulnerability feel like self-exposure rather than connection. If you believe you're fundamentally flawed, revealing yourself feels dangerous. Someone who feels deep shame about their body won't let a partner see them undressed with the lights on. Physical intimacy is blocked by emotional shame. Brené Brown says, "Shame needs 3 things to grow: secrecy, silence, and judgment. Intimacy is the antidote, but it requires the courage to be imperfect. The very thing that would heal shame, connection, is what shame makes hardest to reach for. Trauma can make vulnerability feel dangerous because in the traumatic experience, it was dangerous. Your body remembers what your mind may have moved past. Your shoulders tighten. Your chest feels heavy. You pull away before you even realize you're doing it. These aren't choices. They're protective responses that were once necessary and may no longer be. If you were hurt when you were vulnerable, if trust was betrayed when you let someone in, then intimacy doesn't feel like connection. It feels like setting yourself up to be hurt again. Someone who was emotionally betrayed by a parent may struggle to believe a partner who says, "I'm here for you." Someone who was mocked for showing emotion as a child may learn to keep everything surface level, even with people they love. The historical wound makes present intimacy feel too risky. And here's something worth sitting with. Trauma doesn't have to be dramatic to leave a mark. A friend who shared your secret. A moment where you opened up and were dismissed. A relationship where your feelings were treated as inconvenient. These smaller wounds can quietly teach you that vulnerability isn't safe. And because they seem small, you may not even recognize them as the reason you hold back. If any of this feels familiar, know that those protective walls made sense when they were built. They kept you safe when you needed them. But walls that once protected you can also keep connection out. And with patience, and sometimes with the help of a therapist or someone you trust, those walls can come down at whatever pace feels right for you. Personality disorders create specific intimacy challenges. As mentioned previously, with narcissistic personality disorder, intimacy requires admitting imperfection, and the narcissistic defense can't tolerate this. With avoidant personality disorder, the fear of criticism or rejection makes vulnerability intolerable. With borderline personality disorder, intense fear of abandonment can create rapid swings between desperate intimacy and complete withdrawal. Someone with avoidant tendencies might agree to surface-level activities, but deflect any conversation that goes deeper, asking, "Why do we have to analyze everything?" Attachment disorders also impact intimacy. Anxious attachment can create clinginess or excessive need for reassurance, which can overwhelm relationships. Avoidant attachment leads to emotional distance and difficulty depending on others. Both make sustained, healthy intimacy challenging. Fear of rejection, abandonment, or criticism often stems from early attachment experiences. A child whose emotions were dismissed, "Stop crying, it's not a big deal," learns that vulnerability leads to rejection. As an adult, they might say, "I'm fine," even when they're not, because they learned that showing feelings pushes people away. Fear of losing control also blocks intimacy. Intimacy requires letting someone else influence you, and this feels threatening to people who equate control with safety. Someone who rigidly controls their image might refuse to cry in front of others or admit they don't know something, because these things feel like loss of control. Fear of physical violence destroys intimacy because it undermines the most basic requirement for connection, safety. When you don't feel physically safe with someone, vulnerability becomes impossible. And it's important to understand that actual violence isn't required for this barrier to exist. The fear alone is enough. Hints of potential violence, aggressive gestures, threatening facial expressions, an intimidating tone of voice, or intense outbursts create an environment where intimacy cannot survive. This can be true even if the threats or intensity is directed toward people other than the intimate partner. If someone has to monitor another person's mood to stay safe, they cannot be emotionally open with that person. If you recognize this pattern in your own life, please know that you deserve safety and that help is available. Please seek it. This isn't something you need to navigate alone. Societal and cultural barriers are also significant. Masculinity norms teach that real men don't share feelings, that vulnerability is weakness, that intimacy is women's work. A man raised with "boys don't cry" messages may literally not know how to identify his feelings, making emotional intimacy nearly impossible. American culture often frames needing others as failure rather than being human. Americans glorify independence and self-sufficiency. Productivity culture treats time spent on relationships as inefficient because it doesn't produce measurable output. And the distraction of our digital devices creates constant stimulation that makes the quiet presence that intimacy requires feel boring. There are also common misunderstandings or myths about what intimacy requires. The myth that you have to share everything. No, intimacy requires selective vulnerability, not total disclosure. The myth that intimacy means no boundaries. No, healthy intimacy includes clear boundaries about what's yours to manage and what's mine. The myth that if you're intimate, you won't conflict. No, the Gottmans show that healthy couples still argue. They just repair the connection afterward. Understanding these barriers is important, but the good news is that intimacy is a skill. You can learn to build it and maintain it. That bears repeating. You can learn to build and maintain intimacy. Here are practices grounded in research that actually work. Start with small vulnerabilities. Intimacy is built gradually. You don't start by sharing your deepest secret. Arthur Aaron, a prominent psychologist known for his research on intimacy and relationships, developed a now famous 36-question study that demonstrated that escalating self-disclosure creates closeness. You start with something manageable. I'm feeling stressed about work. As trust builds, you might later share, I'm questioning whether my career has meaning. Small steps create safety for bigger steps. Practice active receiving. When someone shares vulnerability, how you respond determines whether they'll share again. Don't immediately try to fix it, minimize it, or redirect to something else. Just acknowledge it. If your partner says, I feel overwhelmed, a poor response is, you're always stressed. A good response is, that sounds hard. What's making it feel overwhelming? The second response validates their experience and invites them to share more. Turn toward bids for connection. The Gottman method identifies this as crucial. People make small bids for connection constantly. Look at that sunset. I had a tough day. Check out this article. You can ignore them, turn away, dismiss them, turn against, or engage with them, turn toward. If your partner says, check out this article, you could ignore them while scrolling your phone. Say, I'm busy. Or say, oh, interesting. What stood out to you? The third option, turning toward, builds intimacy. The first two erode it. Create containers for vulnerability. Rituals that invite sharing make vulnerability feel safer because they're predictable. Weekly check-ins, post-dinner walks, long drives. These create spaces where deeper conversation is expected. A couple might have a Sunday morning ritual where they ask each other, what's on your mind this week? The predictability of the ritual makes the vulnerability less scary. Share positive experiences too. The Gottmans found that couples need 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction to maintain intimacy. Intimacy isn't just processing pain together. It's also celebrating wins, sharing joy, being playful. Tell your friend about a small accomplishment, not because they need to know, but because sharing delight deepens connection. Be curious. Ask open-ended questions. Assume there's always more to learn about someone, even people you've known for years. Instead of, "How was your day?" which usually gets fine, try, "What was the most interesting part of your day?" Questions that invite reflection and storytelling create opportunities for intimacy. Repair after disconnection. Intimacy requires acknowledging when you've hurt each other and making it right. The Gottmans emphasize that it's not whether you argue. All relationships have friction and conflict. It's whether you repair afterward. For example, I was dismissive earlier when you were trying to tell me about your meeting. I'm sorry. Can we try again? Repair attempts like this maintain intimacy even through conflict. Make time and prioritize it. Intimacy requires presence, undivided attention. It requires nurturing. Despite what productivity culture tells us, intimacy is productive for well-being. Put phones away during dinner. Schedule time with friends the way you schedule work meetings. Treat relationship time as non-negotiable, not as something that happens if nothing more important comes up. Accept the rhythms. Sometimes life is too full for deep intimacy. That's okay. Maintenance mode, staying connected even when you can't go deep, is valid. The goal isn't constant peak intimacy. The goal is sustained connection that can handle the natural ebbs and flows of life. Now, even with the best intentions and practices, we need to talk about when intimacy goes wrong. Understanding how intimacy can go wrong helps you avoid these pitfalls and recognize unhealthy patterns. Too far too fast is a common problem. Sharing deep wounds early can create what's called trauma bonding. You feel intensely close, but you haven't built the foundation to handle that level of vulnerability. Meeting someone and immediately sharing your childhood trauma might create a feeling of intense connection, but you haven't established whether this person is trustworthy with that information. Trust must be earned through repeated small demonstrations of reliability, not granted immediately, because the conversation feels meaningful. Love bombing and premature intimacy are manipulation tactics. Some people use rapid intimacy to establish control. A new romantic partner who says, "I love you," after 2 weeks and wants you to meet their family is creating intensity that feels like intimacy but lacks foundation. Brené Brown emphasizes that trust is built in very small moments. A friend who shows up when they say they will, who keeps confidences, who asks follow-up questions about things you've shared. Those small, repeated actions build predictive trust and can open the door to vulnerability trust, or trust that being vulnerable with someone will not end with a violation. Intimacy imbalance creates problems. When one person is consistently vulnerable while the other remains guarded, it creates resentment and exhaustion. You always share your struggles, but your friend never shares theirs. Eventually, you start feeling like an emotional burden rather than an equal. Healthy intimacy requires reciprocity. Weaponized intimacy can destroy trust permanently. This is when someone uses vulnerable information against you in arguments or to manipulate you. During a fight, your partner brings up something you shared in confidence. "Well, no wonder you struggle with this. You said yourself your parents messed you up. Once intimacy is weaponized, it's nearly impossible to be vulnerable with that person again. Forced intimacy also backfires. Pressuring someone to share before they're ready, often disguised as wanting communication or openness. If you really loved me, you'd tell me what you're thinking. This demand for vulnerability actually prevents it. Real vulnerability can't be coerced. Intimacy without boundaries leads to enmeshment, where boundaries blur and people can't tell where one person ends and another begins. A parent who shares all their marital problems with their child is creating inappropriate intimacy that burdens the child. Healthy intimacy includes knowing what's mine to share and what's yours, what's appropriate for this relationship, and what's not. Performative intimacy is sharing vulnerability for social currency rather than genuine connection. This is common on social media, what some call vulnerability signaling. Someone posts their therapy insights on Instagram, not to connect, but to appear self-aware. It mimics intimacy, but lacks the reciprocity and privacy that real intimacy requires. With all this talk about barriers and what can go wrong, it's important to step back and ask, what does healthy intimacy actually look like? Here are signs that the intimacy in your relationships is functioning well. You can be yourself without performance or pretense. You don't have to carefully manage what you reveal or constantly worry about saying the wrong thing. Conflicts can be discussed and repaired. You don't avoid difficult conversations, and when you do hurt each other, you can acknowledge it and make it right. There's space for both closeness and autonomy. You can be close without losing yourself. You maintain your individual identity while also being part of something shared. Vulnerability is met with respect, not exploitation. When you reveal something tender or difficult, it's held carefully, not used against you later. You feel energized rather than drained by the relationship most of the time. Yes, relationships require effort and sometimes feel draining, but overall, they should add to your life, not deplete it. These markers help you distinguish between healthy intimacy and relationships that mimic intimacy but lack its true substance. It's also worth noting that intimacy looks somewhat different across different relationship types, even though the core elements remain the same. In romantic relationships, all 5 types of intimacy usually come into play: physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and experiential. The combination of all these types, especially physical and emotional intimacy together, is what typically distinguishes romantic relationships from other intimate bonds. In platonic friendships, physical intimacy looks different. Maybe sitting close while watching a movie, a hug goodbye, comfortable physical proximity, but not sexual intimacy. The emphasis is often on emotional, intellectual, and experiential intimacy. In familial relationships, intimacy is complicated by history, obligation, and sometimes unchosen connection. You didn't choose your siblings or parents the way you choose friends or partners. This can make intimacy both deeper in some ways. They've known you your whole life, and more complicated in others, especially if the family patterns weren't healthy. Beyond relationship types, we also need to recognize that what counts as intimate varies by culture. In some cultures, direct eye contact signals respect and attention. In others, it can be seen as aggressive or disrespectful. Physical distance norms differ. Some cultures are comfortable with very close physical proximity, while others maintain more space. Emotional disclosure norms vary widely. In some cultures, Asking detailed questions about someone's family life demonstrates care and interest. In others, the same questions would be considered intrusive and inappropriate. Understanding these variations matters because it helps us avoid mistaking cultural differences for lack of intimacy. Someone from a culture with different disclosure norms isn't necessarily less intimate. They're expressing intimacy according to different rules. As we come to the end of our exploration tonight, let's bring all of this together. Intimacy is both simple and complex. At its core, it's about being known and accepted in the feelings that come with being seen and embraced as you are. But getting there requires vulnerability, time, reciprocity, and skill. It requires us to overcome barriers, both internal and external. It requires maintenance and attention. Intimacy isn't easy, and that's okay. Most of us are still learning, still growing in our capacity for connection and intimacy. You don't need to be perfect at this. You just need to be willing to try, to practice, to show up. And with that willingness, intimacy deepens naturally over time. The research is clear. Intimate relationships are the strongest predictor of happiness and longevity we have. They're essential to our mental and physical health. Learning to build and maintain them is one of the most important investments you can make in your well-being. As you go forward, remember that intimacy isn't about perfection. It's not about always saying the right thing or never hurting each other. It's about showing up, being willing to be seen, responding when someone reaches for you, and repairing the connection when it frays. It's about turning toward each other, again and again, in small moments and large ones. It's about building trust slowly, through consistent, repeated actions that say, "You matter to me," and "Your inner world is important." Start small. Practice turning toward the next bid for connection. Notice when you deflect vulnerability, and consider responding differently. Be patient with yourself and others as you build this skill, because in the end, the depth of our connections with others is the measure of a life well lived. And that depth, that intimacy, is available to all of us if we're willing to do the work of reaching across the space between us and saying, "I see you, and I'm willing to be seen." Rest well tonight, knowing that every small step toward greater intimacy is a step toward a richer, more connected life.